Hello everybody, welcome back to Read and Reread. This is Angelia, and it is time once again for Friday Reads. I'm going to wrap up a rather interesting week in reading and talk about what I have been reading all week and a few other odds and ends, and I hope that you have had a good week as well. We usually start with a little discussion about TV shows, and I don't have anything particularly exciting to report. We finished watching Somebody Somewhere, which I loved. It was so good, and it did not have enough episodes. There's just 2 seasons, and they each have about 6 or 7 beautiful little episodes, but we love that show. And then we kind of started watching, but I don't know that we're going to continue. We watched a few episodes of The Diplomat, and it's just kind of preposterous, and I don't know. I'm not loving that. I was hoping for trashy fun, and it's just kind of, yeah. It's kind of like you could have a really good piece of wonderful cheesecake from a bakery, or you could have a Little Debbie, and then you decide, well, I have this Little Debbie right here, and then it doesn't have enough filling in it, and it's kind of stale. So that's kind of what happened. We also did watch the new Wanda Sykes stand-up special. It's on Netflix, and that was really good. We really liked that. So and then I don't know what we're gonna watch. We wanted to watch Babylon Berlin season 4, and we thought it was going to be on Netflix, and it was not. And then we researched and found out it is nowhere. It is not in the States at all, and so that was disappointing. So now we are adrift between the shows and considering what to watch next. And I have a list of shows that I have heard about or people have recommended, and we'll look through. And if you want to add to my list, fire away. All right, what else? Let's see. I went to a library book sale, and this was one, the way they do it, it's not one of those exciting ones with miles of tables. It's kind of this small crowded thing in a back room in the library that they have a few times a year. It's sort of a rolling thing. But I always go just to see if there's something, and I did get a few, which I'm going to share in a haul video coming up soon, because I'm accumulating a few other things. But I just wanted to show you this one book that I was looking at. I didn't buy this, but I saw this at the fair. I'm going to put its picture up here. And did anyone else have this book in their house in the 70s? The People's Almanac. And we had this one and the sequel that was yellow. My parents had this, and I spent countless hours reading all the weird parts of this book. It's like a 1,000-page reference book of, well, I don't know what else is in it. There's probably some things that are pretty normal in it, but I went straight for the weird stuff as a kid, and I read all the parts about supernatural stuff and paranormal powers, and there was this whole part in there about ESP and clairvoyance, and telekinetic powers. And I would just sit and try to dredge up my telekinetic powers that I was sure were laying in there latently somewhere. So I just really wanted to do that. Astral projection. It had a whole part about crazy ways to die, like spontaneous combustion and whether it was real. And then it had a whole health section that was actually terrifying to 8-year-old Angelia, because it had things like how to deliver your own baby and stuff like that. So that book just brought back memories just seeing it there. And I don't need a outdated reference book that's 1,000 pages long from the 70s, so I did not buy it. But sadly, I put it down. But seeing it just triggered this 70s flood of nostalgia. So let me know if you ever had that book in your household as well. All right, moving on to this week's reading. Last week I was at the very, very end of Things in Jars, and I did talk about it at length last week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today. But I did love this book. I am so excited about this author, and that I have one book left of hers to read, her first book, Himself, and then I will have read everything she's written thus far, and I can't wait to see what she comes out with next, because they seem to be getting better and better. The quickest of recaps is that Things in Jars is set in Victorian England. It is very, very vivid. Sensory details about the time and place are absolutely stunning. And then what's really interesting is there's a juxtaposition here of that realism with some unusual elements, like the fact that one of the important secondary characters is a ghost, and there is also an element of magical realism. Now, before you run for the door, if you don't like magical realism, the whole book is not magical realism. There's just this splash, and it's leavened with skepticism, because Bridie, the main character, she does not believe in such things. Ghosts cannot be real. Beings from folklore cannot possibly be real. How can this be? So you, as a reader, can choose whether you feel like Bridie does, or like some other characters in the story who are more open to such concepts. But there is definitely a coming together of things that could not possibly be occurring, but they are, and what does it mean? I was very satisfied with this book. I loved how the backstory of Bridie's past converges with the present in a meaningful way. It's not just to explain how she got here, but it actually plays a role in the story. I love hearing about how her life as an orphan, she comes over from Ireland to England after her family has passed away, and how her unorthodox upbringing through several different households and settings have lent her a really unusual set of skills and talents that she uses today in her life as a private investigator. And I loved the character Ruby Doyle, the ghost. He starts out as being almost like a joke, and then he grows on you as you read his character, and it's heartbreaking. There's some scenes where it's not like focused upon, but it's just sort of in the passing description, where he will momentarily forget that he's a ghost. There's a scene where he reaches for a piece of fruit on a tree and then retracts his hand because he realizes he can't do it, and it's just kind of devastating. Anyway, I loved Ruby Doyle, and I wanted more of the 7-foot housekeeper Cora. She was also memorable. I'm kind of talking around in circles about a lot of different things, but my point here is, if there is such a beast, is that when I got to the end of the book, it hit me with a surprise book pairing. Do you ever have that happen where there's two books that all of a sudden you're thinking about them together and you never would have expected that to happen? And that happened here when I got to the end of this book and I considered some elements of the story, and especially the ending. It was a surprise book pairing with Our Wives Under the Sea. If you've read both books, tell me if you see this. And if you have not read both books, I do recommend both of these books. They have nothing in common for a long time, and then all of a sudden you get to the end and you think, oh. So let me know if you see this as well. But that was really good. Things in Jars, just kid. Also this week, I finally did finish How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith. This is a nonfiction book that I've been reading for several weeks, and the subtitle is A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. There was a description in this book, where is it, that kind of describes how I felt reading it, because I learned in each section of the book, Clint Smith travels to different places, mostly in the U.S., but at the end of the book, he does travel to Senegal. And he is looking at the history of slavery, how it informs our present, what pieces are missing in our understanding and our education. And then there's also his personal narrative about the meaning of this to him as a Black man living in America. And there's a part early on where he is talking to a man named John, who is the person who has financed the restoration of the Whitney plantation in Louisiana. And this is a rare case where the historical site has been restored to highlight the lives of enslaved people, their history, and that legacy, rather than focusing on the beautiful grounds and the lovely mansion like most of the plantations. And John talks about his own experience when he began to research and read all of these slave narratives. And he says, you get an eerie feeling because it's their words, more or less, and you feel as though someone is talking to you who never had a voice. And all of a sudden you feel very strange. It's not a feeling of guilt, it's a feeling of discovered ignorance. I don't know how else to explain it. When you wonder, how could this have happened and I didn't know about it? How could that happen? And I felt like that a number of times reading this book, where I thought I knew about the place or the time that he was describing, and then I did not, and I had discovered ignorance. And there were some things I had never heard of in here, like the Seneca village that was on the site of what is now Central Park. And so I had many instances of discovered ignorance and illumination while reading this book, and I thought it was excellent. And I don't read a ton of nonfiction, as I have mentioned many a time, but I really was glad that I took the time to read this book, How the Word is Passed. Highly recommend it. If you don't have time now, put it on your list for Nonfiction November if you have not read it yet. Going back to fiction, I next read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This book is slim. It's pretty short. I think it's under 200 pages. It is this edition is 185 pages, but don't let that fool you. It is highly concentrated. It is slim but potent. And this was one of the authors that I talked about in my literary white whales video, where someone who I had not read anything, that came out awkwardly, an author whose works I have never read. That didn't sound much better. But anyway, no, I had not read anything by James Baldwin, and I started here. It's very glary. And this was, it was something. This is the story of a young man, but he's not that young. That's part of the plot. It's a young man named David who is American, but he goes to Paris, and basically it's one of those stories where he would say he's going to find himself and see what kind of adventures he can have. He's really trying to escape himself, but if you take yourself with you, there you are. It is the 1950s, and David is trying desperately to suppress his homosexuality. He has an early encounter with a teenage friend that leaves him shocked and confused and kind of horrified with himself, and he has this terrible, long-lasting self-loathing. The first thing that surprised me about this book was that David is white, and I started to read the book, and I came across his description early on, and I was like, wait a minute, what? And so I went and did a little research, and I found out that when Baldwin released his first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, I guess that book is set in Harlem. The main characters are black, and then here he comes with his second book, which is Giovanni's Room. And the publishers were also, they were shocked, and they weren't too happy about it, that he has a story about white people in Paris struggling with their sexual identity. And that was not the book that they were expecting, or that they thought that the reading public wanted. And they told him that they weren't going to publish the book, and he had to go to a different publisher. But I'm glad that he did find a publisher, because this book was excellent. David is in Paris, where he meets an American young woman, and he has a relationship with her and proposes marriage. And she says, well, you know, I'm going to think about it. And she goes to Spain for a while to meander around. And while she's gone, he meets Giovanni. It's really about David's unwillingness to accept and embrace his true identity, the societal pressures that are leading him to feeling this way, just the sensation of being trapped in himself, and it's the physical confines of Giovanni's tiny little bedsit apartment sort of being a metaphor for that as well. They can exist in this little bubble, but not in the world. And I think that this book shines the most in dialogue. There are several conversations that are just brilliant in this book, and they are the parts that really last for me. There's some conversations between David and an older man named Jacques, between David and Giovanni, David and Hella, and a lot of are on the theme of trying to point out to David how sealed off he is, how he's not really living, how he is dodging the truth about himself. And even in talking to his father, writing a letter, his father's like, what are you doing? His father doesn't really know all these things that are going on, but he's still like, what exactly are you doing? When are you going to start your real life? And on many levels, David is stuck. We hear that he's in his late 20s, and several times someone points out, you're not really that young anymore. You're not college age anymore. You should have moved on past that phase of now I'm beginning and something else should be happening. But it isn't. And there are just some devastating conversations in this book. There's a part in this book where he's talking, like actually a couple of parts, where he is talking to his girlfriend Hella, and she's trying to draw out of him what it is that's bothering him so much, but at the same time, she doesn't really want to. She kind of knows what it is, but she doesn't want to. And so she keeps trying to give him these outs. And it reminded me very much of all things, The Age of Innocence and May Welland, when Archer comes to her and says, you know what, we need to get married right now. Let's just hurry up and wrap it up. And she's like, well, wait a minute. Why the hurry? What's really going on? Do you need to go? Do we need to just drop this? And trying to give him that escape route without confronting the truth. And I feel like that was at play in Hella's character a little bit. But anyway, I found it to be, I'm really glad that I read this modern classic, and it doesn't take very long to read, but it is very powerful. So I do recommend Giovanni's Room if you have not read it. So after Giovanni's Room, I wanted to read something more contemporary, a little bit lighter in tone, and I guess I accomplished that because I read the Guncle. And I knew going in that it wasn't a fluffy book. We'd already established that it is not nearly as fluffy as this poorly planned cover, but I will say it is both funny and sad. Most people who have reviewed it have said the same. It was really good. This is the first book I read by Stephen Rowley, and I have been eyeballing this book for a couple of years and thinking, well, is this good, or is it just, you know, super fluffy and beach ready, not in a good way? And it kind of reminds me of when we were talking about fluffy books and books with certain kinds of covers, and Stephen said, yeah, what's that author, and all of her books are like pictures of women's feet on a beach? I think he was thinking of Ellen Hildebrand, is that her name? I've never read any of her books, so I'm not disparaging them, but I knew what he was talking about. But anyway, the Guncle is not that kind of a book. The Guncle is about a man named Patrick who has been a very successful TV actor, and he was on a long-running show, but it ended a few years ago, and he has kind of retreated to his beautiful Palm Springs home, and he has kind of shut himself off from everything and everybody. He doesn't really have a lot of friends that come or family. He hasn't worked in several years, and we gradually find out the real reasons versus his professed reasons for this self-imposed isolation. But his best friend Sarah from college, he meets Sarah freshman year, and they become very good friends, and Sarah goes on to marry Patrick's brother Greg. But Sarah has cancer, and she, at the very beginning of this book, this is not a spoiler, the book begins with the fact that Sarah has died. And Sarah and Greg have two children, Maisie and Grant, who are, I think, 6 and 9 when the story opens. And so Patrick flies home to Connecticut for this funeral. And while he is there, Greg kind of ambushes him with a bomb to drop that during the course of Sarah's illness, he has become dependent on prescription painkillers to blunt his own anxiety and anguish. He started dipping into painkillers, and now he's hooked, and he really needs to go to rehab because all of a sudden he's a single parent. He's got to get it together, and he asks Patrick to take the kids for 90 days while he goes through his rehab. And he's picked a place near Patrick's home, and he just lays all this on him at the airport right when he gets there. And Patrick is stunned, to say the least. So after a little bit of hemming and hawing and having a conflict with their other sibling, his sister, he reluctantly takes these children back to his home. And so it is a funny and sad story about a lot of things, but mainly about grief, about different ways to deal with it, what time does for you, what taking risks can do for you. And of course, through the process of trying to support the children, he has to come to terms with some things about himself that he has not fully dealt with. And there are lots of funny scenes. There are unexpected characters that add warmth and depth to the story. And Patrick also, at first he seems, he's got that, you know what, when I was watching Somebody Somewhere, he kind of reminded me of Sam, that kind of funny, sarcastic demeanor, but if you get too close, a wall comes up, and he's kind of like that, but eventually events and people around him are chipping away at the wall, and he's realizing it about himself, and he has to make some changes. So it was very enjoyable. And I will look for other books by this author. If you've read other books by Stephen Rowley that you thought also were as good as this one, please let me know in the comments, because I really enjoyed this. So, in a week where I read Giovanni's Room, that was actually not the saddest book of the week, because now I'm reading Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart. This was one of the books that I have to read for the BookTube prize. So it was not on my original June TBR, although it could be, because it is a book that somebody might choose to read for Pride Month. But this is a book, I haven't read anything by this author. I didn't read Shuggie Bain, and I haven't read this, but it is in the list of books that I need to read to judge the BookTube prize. So I cannot talk about my thoughts on this book until August 1st, I guess, when the new period is over, but I have several books I need to read, and all of them are kind of thick. I'm actually not too far from the end. Generally what it's about, it's set in Glasgow, Scotland. I think it's the 80s, could be early 90s, I'm not entirely sure, but it's about a boy named Mungo who is a teenager. I think he's 15 when the story starts, and he lives in a housing project at poverty. He lives with his, sometimes lives with his mother, who's an alcoholic, but she comes and goes, and he has an older brother and sister. The brother's involved in gang activity in the area, and he's kind of the lead of a gang, and it's a tough and bleak kind of existence. And into his life, he meets another teenage boy named James. Mungo's family is Protestant, James is Catholic, and a romance begins. So that is all I really can tell you until the time comes that I can make comments, but I'm in the last maybe 20% of the book right now. After I finish reading Young Mungo, before I read another one of the BookTube books, I want to roll back to my TBR once again. So I will be looking on my cart for my next read, and I'm gonna probably try to pick something that appears to be of a lighter tone after Young Mungo. That's all I can say about that right now. But so that's what I have planned for the weekend. I'll finish that up and then choose something else from my cart. So let me know what you have planned. If you've read any of these books, or you plan to, or what else did you read this week? What was your best book of the week? And also any other show recommendations. If you know of something that I should put on my list I will give it due consideration. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend and that it is not 97 degrees where you live, although, you know, I chose this place on purpose, so I should not complain. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.